Sarah was a force of nature, a whirlwind of curiosity and nerve. Most folks thought she was too brave or maybe just plain crazy. But Sarah, she didn't care much for whispers or warnings. She craved the unknown, the unexplained. See, Sarah was a final year med student, a brain box they called her, but her curiosity, it went beyond textbooks and dissections. She had a soft spot for the strange, the eerie, the downright spooky. One late night, hunched over anatomy books with a classmate, Sarah stumbled upon it. A legend whispered in hushed tones, a place most folks avoided like the plague. "The Red Cemetery," her classmate muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's eyes lit up. "This," she thought, "this is what I've been waiting for." The Red Cemetery wasn't your typical graveyard. No, sir, this one had a reputation, a nasty one. Locals would tell you the soil ran red from the blood of souls trapped within its gates. Whispers and tales followed the cemetery like a shroud. Stories passed down through generations, tales of cold spots, disembodied voices, and shadows that moved with a life of their own. Some folks claimed the cemetery was built on cursed land, a place where ancient, unholy rituals had stained the earth. They said the spirits of those who died there, they never truly left. Friday night rolled around. While others hit the bars and clubs, Sarah, she had other plans. She grabbed her flashlight, pulled on her jacket. Tonight she was going on an adventure. The air grew colder as she neared the cemetery gates. A shiver ran down her spine. Don't be ridiculous, she thought. It's just an old graveyard. But there was no denying the feeling. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. With a groan, the rusty gates swung open. It was as if the cemetery itself was welcoming her, or maybe warning her. Sarah stepped inside. The ground crunched under her feet. That blood-red dirt, it was like nothing she'd ever seen. It felt wrong, unnatural. She shone her flashlight around. Rows of tombstones stretched out before her. A sea of stone, cold and silent. The air grew colder. A chill ran down her spine. She shook it off. "Don't be silly," she told herself. "It's just the wind." But deep down, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She walked deeper into the cemetery. The tombstones were old, many cracked and covered in moss. Names and dates, worn away by time, were barely visible. Each step felt heavier than the last. The silence pressed in on her. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt expectant, like something was waiting. She stopped at a particularly large tombstone. The inscription was completely gone, but as she reached out to touch it, she felt it, a faint vibration. It thrummed beneath her fingers, a low hum that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. Section 2. The Whispering Dead. Sarah pulled her hand back as if burned. She shone her light around, but there was nothing. Just the tombstones, silent and still. She listened. The silence was broken now by a low, mournful whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wind picked up, swirling around her. The whispers grew louder. Words, fragments of sentences carried on the breeze. She couldn't make them out, but the sound sent shivers down her spine. It was the sound of sorrow, of anger, of something ancient and deeply unsettling. She thought she saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. She swung her flashlight around, but it was gone. Just her imagination, she thought, trying to calm her racing heart. But the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. A twig snapped. She whirled around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the wind whistling through the trees and those whispers, those damned whispers growing louder, closer. She had to get out of there. Section 3. The Ancient Mausoleum. She turned to leave, but her flashlight beam fell on something else. Hidden amongst the trees, almost completely obscured by shadows, was a mausoleum. It was old, far older than any of the surrounding graves. The stone was cracked and weathered, and the iron gate hung precariously from its hinges. She should leave. She knew it, but something drew her towards the mausoleum, a morbid curiosity perhaps, or maybe something else, something she couldn't quite name. She took a deep breath and walked towards it. The gate creaked open with a groan that echoed through the cemetery. a sound that seemed to claw at the silence. She shone her flashlight inside. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre decorations. In the center of the mausoleum stood a single stone sarcophagus. It was ornately carved, depicting scenes of death and mourning. The lid of the sarcophagus was slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to open it or something. Section 1. A voice from the stone. The air inside the mausoleum felt different, heavier somehow, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand on end. She took a hesitant step closer, drawn to the sarcophagus like a moth to a flame. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then a whisper, so faint she almost missed it. It seemed to emanate from the sarcophagus itself, a low, mournful sigh. "Sarah." The voice sent a shiver down her spine. It was a woman's voice, weak and raspy, as if from beyond the grave. She knew she should run, get out of there while she still could, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She shone her flashlight on the sarcophagus, her hand trembling. The stone was cold to the touch, and she could feel that faint vibration again, that hum that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. Section 2. The apparition. Sarah. The voice whispered again, closer now, stronger. The air around her grew colder, and a strange mist began to rise from the opening in the sarcophagus. The mist swirled and coalesced, taking on a vaguely human form. Sarah watched in horror as the figure solidified. It was a woman, or at least the ghostly remnants of one. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow sockets burning with an eerie internal light. The woman reached out a hand, her touch icy cold as it brushed against Sarah's arm. Sarah gasped, a scream catching in her throat. The woman's touch sent a jolt of fear through her, a primal terror she had never known. "Leave this place," the ghost hissed, her voice a raspy whisper. "Leave now while you still can." Section 3. Fleeing the dead. The ghost's touch snapped Sarah out of her trance. Adrenaline surged through her and she turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. She could hear the ghost's voice behind her echoing through the mausoleum. "You should not have come here," the voice wailed. "You have disturbed the dead." Sarah didn't dare look back. She scrambled out of the mausoleum, her heart pounding in her chest. The rusty gate swung shut behind her with a clang, as if sealing her fate. She sprinted through the cemetery, her lungs burning, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. The whispers were back, louder than before, swirling around her, taunting her. She could feel the ghost's presence behind her, cold and menacing. She didn't slow down, not even when she reached the cemetery gates. She threw herself at them, her shoulder slamming against the rusted metal. The gates creaked open, and she stumbled out onto the road, falling to her knees in the dirt. Section 4. The haunting begins. Sarah didn't slow down until she reached the sanctuary of her apartment. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it, bolting it, as if that would keep out the horrors she had witnessed. She tried to tell herself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But deep down she knew the truth. She had seen something real in that mausoleum, something that defied explanation, something that chilled her to the core. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her, filled with images of the ghostly woman, her hollow eyes burning into Sarah's very soul. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin still lingering. During the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of her vision. Whispers followed her, faint and indistinct, but undeniably present. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. She couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her home from that cemetery. Days turned into weeks, but the haunting continued. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open and slammed shut, and the temperature in her apartment plummeted without reason. She tried to confide in her friends, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the unexplainable? They would think she was crazy, and maybe she was. But that didn't make the fear any less real. One night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard it. The voice, clear as day, whispering her name from the darkness. Sarah. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She could feel a presence in the room with her, cold and menacing. Her eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows, but she could see nothing. Sarah, we are here. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They swirled around her, wrapping around her like icy fingers, dragging her down into the darkness. She was trapped, her worst nightmare come true. The spirits of the Red Cemetery had followed her home. The light began to fade from Sarah's life. Sunlight, once so warm and inviting, now felt harsh and intrusive. She withdrew into herself, a prisoner in her own home. The whispers followed her everywhere. They taunted her, mocked her, reminded her of the darkness that clung to her. Sleep, once an escape, became a terrifying ordeal. The ghostly woman from the mausoleum haunted her dreams, her hollow eyes boring into Sarah's soul. Her studies, once her passion, now seemed trivial, meaningless. How could she focus on anatomy and physiology when her own world was unraveling? Her grades plummeted. Her friends, worried, tried to reach out, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance, lost in the fog that had descended upon her mind. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace. Every creak of the floorboard a whispered threat. The walls of her apartment, once a source of comfort and security, were closing in, suffocating her. Doubt gnawed at her sanity. Was she going mad? Was this all in her head? Her medical training told her that ghosts weren't real, that there had to be a logical explanation for what she was experiencing. She tried to convince herself that she was just stressed, overworked, that her mind was playing tricks on her. She tried to rationalize the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin, but deep down, a primal fear told her otherwise. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at her. Her skin was pale, her hair dull and lifeless. The spark of curiosity that had once burned so brightly in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull flicker of fear. She was losing herself, consumed by the darkness that had seeped into her life from that cursed cemetery. The thought terrified her, but it was a terrifying thought, mixed with a strange sense of inevitability. One night, the haunting took a sinister turn. She lay in bed, her body exhausted, her mind racing. Sleep wouldn't come, not tonight, not with the feeling of dread that hung so heavily in the air. The room grew cold, the temperature plummeting as if a window had been thrown open. But there was no breeze, no sound of wind or rain, just a deathly stillness that pressed down on her, suffocating her. Then she saw it. At the foot of her bed, a shadow coalesced from the darkness. It swirled and twisted, taking on the shape of the ghostly woman from the mausoleum. Her eyes, hollow black pits, burned into Sarah's soul. Terror, raw and primal, surged through her. She tried to scream, to move, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place by an unseen force. The ghostly woman glided closer, her movements fluid, effortless, as if she were a creature of smoke and shadow. "You are mine now," the ghost whispered, her voice a chilling rasp that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. "You belong to the Red Cemetery." The ghostly hand touched Sarah's forehead and a jolt of icy fire surged through her body. She screamed, a sound that died in her throat, unheard, unheeded. Her vision blurred, the room spinning wildly. Then darkness swallowed her whole. When Sarah awoke, she found herself lying on the cold, damp ground. Disoriented, she sat up and looked around. Tombstones, ancient and weathered, surrounded her. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the sound of mournful whispers carried on the wind. She was back in the Red Cemetery, trapped in a labyrinth of the dead. And this time she knew there would be no escape. The spirits had claimed her, body and soul. She was lost to the world, a prisoner of the Red Cemetery, forever bound to the restless dead. Sarah, the girl who once embraced life with open arms, was gone, vanished. The spark in her eyes, the one that had always burned so brightly, was extinguished, replaced by a dull, haunting emptiness. The world, once a place of wonder and excitement, had become a dim, shadowy reflection of its former self. She was a ghost in her own life, a spectre haunting the halls of her apartment, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her once bright smile, now a distant memory, rarely graced her lips. The joy that had once radiated from her, drawing people in with its warmth, had been replaced by an icy chill that pushed them away. The world outside continued to spin, oblivious to the torment that raged within her. The sun rose and set, oblivious to the darkness that had enveloped her soul. The laughter of children playing in the street was a distant echo, a painful reminder of a life she could no longer remember. She was adrift in a sea of shadows, the once familiar landmarks of her life swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Her dreams, once filled with aspirations and ambitions, had become nightmares, haunted by the ghostly woman and the oppressive presence of the Red Cemetery. Her textbooks lay open on the table, the pages filled with intricate diagrams of the human body, a subject that had once fascinated her. Now the words seemed to blur and swim before her eyes, their meaning lost in the fog that had descended upon her mind. She was a stranger in a familiar land, her own body a foreign entity. The scalpel, once an instrument of precision and knowledge, now felt cold and heavy in her hand, a symbol of the life she had once aspired to. Her reflection in the mirror was a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root within her. Her skin, once radiant with life, was now ashen and pale, stretched taut over her cheekbones. Her eyes, once sparkling with intelligence and curiosity, were now dull and lifeless, two dark pools reflecting the emptiness that consumed her soul. She was a shell of her former self, a hollowed-out vessel haunted by the spirits of the Red Cemetery. The girl who had once dared to explore the unknown had become a prisoner of her own fear, trapped in a labyrinth of her own making. The Red Cemetery held her captive, its grip on her soul tightening with each passing day. She could feel its presence everywhere, a suffocating weight on her chest, a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed her. The whispers followed her, taunting her with fragments of memories distorted and laced with a chilling malice. They whispered of her failure, of her weakness, of her inevitable surrender to the darkness. She dreamed of the cemetery, its twisted trees and crumbling tombstones a constant backdrop to her nightmares. In her dreams, she wandered aimlessly through its overgrown paths, her footsteps echoing in the silence, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The cemetery had become her prison, its walls closing in on her, suffocating her with its oppressive presence. She was bound to it, tethered to its darkness by an invisible chain forged in fear and despair. The world outside faded to a distant hum, its vibrant colors and chaotic symphony replaced by the cold, silent embrace of the Red Cemetery, the warmth of the sun, the gentle caress of the breeze, the sounds of life and laughter. All were lost to her, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. She was no longer Sarah, the curious girl who had dared to tempt fate. She was nothing more than a vessel, a hollow shell inhabited by the restless spirits of the Red Cemetery. Their whispers filled her mind, their will her own. The ghostly woman from the mausoleum, her face a mask of both triumph and sorrow, stood over Sarah's lifeless form. Her work was done. The Red Cemetery had claimed another soul, adding another name to its ever-growing list of victims. The shadows stretched and danced, their forms shifting and swirling in the twilight. The Red Cemetery, its thirst for life momentarily sated, settled back into an uneasy silence, its secrets buried deep beneath the blood-red earth, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its path.